Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now, sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. I remember the sign before I remembered the shelter. It was bolted, crooked to the brick wall beside the old county courthouse annex in our town, one of those square concrete and brick government buildings from the 1950s that nobody loved enough to maintain and nobody hated enough to tear down. The sign was white once, maybe, but by the time I paid attention to it again, it was stained gray and green, cracked through one corner, and half covered by ivy. The faded black letters still read Fallout Shelter, with an arrow pointing down toward a basement entrance that had been chained shut since I was a kid. I used to pass it on my way to the elementary school where I subbed, coffee in one hand, tote bag in the other, thinking it was just one more weird leftover from another era. Old people in town talked about civil defense drills and canned crackers and Geiger counters like they were telling ghost stories. I would smile, nod, and go teach third graders how to write complete sentences. Then the outbreak started, and within 4 days, that sign became the most important thing in my life. My name is Denise Carver. I was 38 years old when everything came apart. I was a substitute teacher in Jefferson County, south of St. Louis, the kind of job where you learn everybody's routines but belong nowhere long enough to be missed if you stop showing up. I had a small duplex rental on the edge of town, an aging Honda Civic with a check engine light I kept ignoring, and exactly one living relative in state, my older brother, Mark, a forklift mechanic in Fenton. We were on speaking terms in the way people are when they love each other but spend years being tired. By the time the police station went dark, I had not heard from him in almost 30 hours. The first day didn't look like the end of the world. It looked like confusion. There were reports coming in from St. Louis County and then the city. Road closures, emergency rooms overloaded, violent medical incidents. A phrase every station used because nobody wanted to say what people were seeing. Parents started arriving early at school to pull their kids out. By noon, our principal was in the hallway with her phone pressed to her ear, trying to reach a central office while teachers kept everyone calm with worksheets and movie cards. I was covering a 4th grade class that day. I remember writing, "Read quietly," on the board and thinking my handwriting looked too neat for what was happening outside. By 1 o'clock, the district sent a message to dismiss. Buses were delayed because some drivers had not reported in. Half the parents came in a rush. The other half never came at all, and we waited with those kids in the library until deputies arrived to escort the remaining students to a temporary reunification site at the high school gym. I volunteered to stay because I kept thinking if I just made it to the next step, someone official would explain everything. No one did. That evening, cell networks were overloaded. Local radio became more useful than television. The advice shifted every 2 hours. Shelter in place, avoid contact, report bites. Do not approach symptomatic individuals. Then, overnight, avoid all unnecessary travel. By morning, unnecessary meant almost everything. On the second day, I drove to the grocery store and saw what panic actually looked like. Not a movie panic, not screaming and running. It was slower, meaner, more embarrassing. People arguing over batteries. People loading carts with dog food they didn't own a dog for. A man trying to pull a pallet of bottled water with his bare hands because the employees refused to bring a jack to the floor. A woman in scrubs crying by the pharmacy gate because she needed a prescription that no one was there to fill. I bought what I could. Canned soup, peanut butter, crackers, shelf-stable milk, instant coffee, a box of trash bags, bleach, paper towels, a hand-crank flashlight/radio combo from a seasonal display, and 2 packs of AA batteries. I also bought children's bandages with cartoon dinosaurs on them because they were the only bandages left. At checkout, the cashier, Tina, whose son had been in my class 2 years earlier, looked at my pile and said, "Miss Carver, you think it's really that bad?" I told her I didn't know. That was the last normal conversation I had for a while. On the third day, there were roadblocks near the interstate exits. The county sheriff's office put out a statement saying they were consolidating response efforts and asking residents to remain inside. The local police posted once on social media around 9 in the morning, then nothing. Around lunchtime, I heard sirens running hard toward the highway and then stopping, all at once, like someone had cut power to the sound. I called Mark again and again, straight to voicemail. By late afternoon, my street was wrong in a way I can still hear. Doors opening and closing. Engines revving, then stalling. Someone shouting for "Mom," 2 houses over. A dog barking itself hoarse. No lawnmowers, no kids, no leaf blowers. No regular background life. That night, I dragged my couch against the front door and slept in my clothes with a kitchen knife under the cushion, which I knew was not useful, but gave my hands something to do. On the 4th day, the power flickered off and on 3 times before settling into a low, unreliable hum. Water pressure dropped. My phone battery went below 20%. I sat on the kitchen floor, listening to the hand crank radio and heard a state-level emergency briefing that boiled down to this. Services were disrupted, authorities were overwhelmed, and people should secure themselves where they were. Where I was had 2 doors, 6 windows, and neighbors I could hear moving around. I packed the Civic by noon. I did not leave because I was brave. I left because I could hear someone trying doorknobs down the block. The courthouse annex was less than 10 minutes away if roads were clear. I chose it because of the sign, because I remembered the chained basement door, and because my brain wanted one solid idea to move toward. I also knew the building. Old records office on the main floor, assessor's overflow files in a side wing, county meeting room nobody used except for tax sales and blood drives. Thick walls. Few windows at street level. Not perfect, but better than my duplex. The drive took 23 minutes. Main Street was partially blocked by 2 pickups nose to nose at an angle. Doors open, nobody inside. I cut through a church parking lot, scraped a curb hard enough to make my teeth click, and came up behind the feed store where I had to stop for a cluster of people moving in the road. They were not moving together, not really. 3 looked like they were trying to help a 4th. Then the 4th turned and grabbed at one of them with a kind of blind force I had only seen once before, when a student in a panic attack bit another child's hand. That force without awareness. The man being grabbed fell backward, the others scattered. I did not stay to watch. I reached the courthouse square with maybe a quarter tank left and no idea what I would do if the basement door was welded shut. The annex lot was mostly empty. A county maintenance truck sat sideways across 2 spaces with the driver's side door hanging open. The courthouse itself, the older stone building with the clock tower, looked sealed and dead. The annex was quieter, but one window on the east side had been broken sometime in the last year and covered with plywood from inside. I parked behind the building near the dumpsters where the Civic was less visible from the street. The fallout shelter sign was still there. The chain on the basement door was newer than the sign. Thick hardware store steel looped through the handles and secured with a laminated padlock. The hasp screws were rusted, but the lock body wasn't. I had a tire iron, a lug wrench, and a claw hammer from my trunk. I also had exactly 1 swing in me before I started thinking the noise would carry. The padlock took 4 hits. The first 2 rang through the alley so loud I froze and listened after each one. The third dented the lock body. The 4th snapped the hasp staple screws out of soft wood. I caught the chain before it hit the concrete, lowered it as gently as I could, and stood there shaking so hard I had to sit on the steps before I could pull the door open. Cold, stale air came up from below. Dust, old concrete, metal. the smell of a closed place that had kept its own weather for decades. I clicked on my flashlight and went down. The staircase was poured concrete with a steel handrail welded to brackets along one wall. Halfway down, there was another door, this one heavier, painted institutional green, with a circular dog-wheel-style handle and a latch mechanism that looked more serious than anything above ground. The words "shelter area" were stenciled in black, faded but legible. A smaller metal plaque beside the frame said, "Capacity 120." I remember laughing once, a short, ugly sound because my duplex barely held one, and I just found a room built for 120. The interior was exactly what the sign promised, and nothing like what I expected. No glowing bunker, no secret military stockpile. Just a set of municipal basement rooms converted for Cold War civil defense and then mostly forgotten. The main shelter room was long and low-ceilinged. Concrete block walls painted off-white and flaking in places. Rows of steel pipe bunks were stacked and nested against one wall, the canvas cots folded on top. Metal shelves stood empty except for dust, and a few cardboard boxes collapsed with age. There were several blue-painted steel drums marked "potable water" in white stencil, each with old taps and hand pumps. A wall cabinet labeled medical supplies was unlocked and mostly empty except for expired gauze packets, triangular bandages, a rust-specked pair of trauma shears, and a manual. There were signs everywhere, simple black on yellow or black on white. No smoking, latrine area, first aid, radiation monitor post, food storage. Near the entrance, bolted to a board, was a printed instruction sheet sealed under yellowing plastic. If shelter is occupied, the shelter manager will maintain order. I stood there with my flashlight on that sentence for a long time. The manual in the medical cabinet was a civil defense handbook from the early 1960s. It was written for volunteers, plain and bossy and weirdly calm. It assumed fear would be contagious before disease was. It had sections on sanitation, rationing, conflict, rumor control, and assigning jobs to stop people from spiraling. A whole chapter on leadership under crowd stress, as if the greatest threat in a fallout event would be somebody starting an argument over crackers. At the time, I thought it was outdated. Later, I realized it was one of the most practical things in the room. I spent the rest of that first afternoon doing what I always did on bad days in classrooms. Inventory, routines, simple tasks. Count first, feel later. There were 4 rooms besides the main shelter hall, a small office with a desk and old rotary phone disconnected from the wall, a storage room with broken folding chairs and county records boxes eaten by mildew, a utility room with electrical panels, an old belt-driven blower assembly, and ventilation duct controls, and a latrine room with 2 toilets, a utility sink, and a floor drain. The water in the pipes still ran, but pressure was weak and sputtering. The toilets flushed once with enough force to clear, then refilled slowly. I filled buckets in every container I could find immediately. The ventilation system mattered. I understood that much even before I fully understood the problem it would become. This shelter had been designed to cycle air while filtering out fallout dust, not to hide from hearing. There were intake and exhaust ducts that ran up through the building, with manual dampers and a powered blower. The blower still worked when I tested it, but the bearings squealed and the vibration traveled through the ductwork like a metal drum. With the blower off, the shelter was quiet enough to hear your own pulse. With it on, you could probably hear it in the basement hallway upstairs. I shut it off after 10 seconds. By evening, I had dragged 1 bunk frame into the office, set up a cot, and moved supplies there so I could sleep behind a door instead of in the open hall. I carried down my grocery bags, a case of bottled water, the tire iron, the hammer, 2 blankets, and a backpack. I left the Civic where it was and covered the back window from inside with an old county road map so nobody passing close would see the food. At some point after dark, I sat at the desk in the office, turned the hand crank radio low, and ate peanut butter crackers while reading a chapter called Maintaining Morale in Confined Groups. I was one person in a room built for 120, and I was reading advice about group morale like it was homework. That first night underground taught me the main rule of the shelter. Nothing stayed private once sound touched metal. I woke up around 1:30 in the morning because I could hear voices. Not in the room, in the ducts. At first, I thought I was dreaming. That half-sleep state where the building makes noises and your brain turns them into speech. Then I heard a cough, clear and close, followed by a man's voice somewhere above me saying, "Check that side office." Every muscle in my body locked. I killed the flashlight and sat on the cot holding my breath. There were footsteps overhead, muffled through concrete but distinct. Something scraped across the floor upstairs. A door banged. Another voice, higher, maybe younger. Nothing down here but old files. Then, through the vent grill near the office ceiling, I heard it again as if they were standing in the room with me. "Take the copper if you can get it loose." They were in the annex. Maybe scavengers. Maybe just desperate people stripping what they could. They did not know about the shelter door, or if they did, they hadn't checked the alley. I stayed in the dark until dawn. That was the moment the shelter stopped being a lucky find and became a problem to solve. It could hide me from sight. It could not hide me from sound if I wasn't careful. Over the next 3 days, I built a routine around silence. Mornings, I listened at the stairs before opening the inner door. Then, I checked the alley through the crack of the outer door, moved fast, and brought in what I needed from the car. I made one trip each morning, no more. I stopped using the trunk light after the second day because I realized the faint glow could be seen under the lid at night. I kept my movements below ground slow and deliberate. No dropped tools, no metal on metal, unless I wrapped it in cloth. I used the hand crank radio only in the office with a blanket hung over the vent grill. I boiled nothing because I had no safe way to vent smell or noise. I ate cold soup straight from the can and told myself I preferred it. The county water failed completely on my 3rd day in the shelter. I had expected it. I was still angry. The taps coughed air and brown water, and then nothing. I had maybe 27 gallons in mixed containers from what I'd filled, plus whatever was in the old shelter drums if they were still usable. I tested one drum first by opening the top bung with a pipe wrench from the utility room. The gasket cracked but came free. The water inside smelled flat, metallic, but not rotten. I filtered a small amount through a camping filter I had in my car, then boiled a cup on a sterno can from an emergency kit I found in the storage room. I let it cool and drank it sitting on the floor with my back against concrete, waiting to see if I'd be sick. I wasn't. I treated the drums as emergency reserve after that. The manuals had assumed rotation and maintenance. This place had gotten neither. Still, old sealed water in steel was better than no water. Food was the larger problem. I had maybe a week if I was strict, less if I started stress eating. The shelter had no rations left, just rust-out lines on shelves where cans once sat. On day 4 underground, I made the first trip beyond the annex. I waited until mid-morning because the street noises had thinned by then. Dawn and dusk were worst. People moving, vehicles, shouting, things I did not want to meet in low light. I dressed in layers that didn't rustle, tied my hair back, wore gardening gloves and a county employee windbreaker I found upstairs because it made me look official from a distance. I carried a backpack, a pry bar, and a hammer. The only firearm I had access to was a .38 revolver in my brother's locked toolbox 30 miles away, so the hammer and pry bar were what I had. I also carried a whistle and hoped I'd never use it. The town center looked looted in patches, not uniformly. It turns out panic has roots. The pharmacy and supermarket were gutted. The dollar store had been hit hard but not cleanly. Aisles ripped apart, goods scattered, people grabbing for obvious items and missing half the useful ones. The feed store was broken into but mostly intact because apparently few people prioritize fence staples and mineral blocks when society is failing. I did. I also took work gloves, zip ties, duct tape, a roll of wire mesh, 2 tarps, a box of nails, and a hand-operated siphon pump. At the hardware store, whose front windows were smashed and security gate bent, I found pry bars, a manual can opener, PVC fittings, and foam insulation sheets. I left behind things I wanted and couldn't carry. I moved fast. Twice I hid when I heard voices. Once I crouched behind a display of bagged salt while 2 men argued over chainsaw fuel 5 aisles away. One of them was crying while he yelled. That sound stayed with me more than the words. I made it back to the annex, sweating through my shirt and shaking from the come-down. The duct problem got worse before it got better. That evening, while I was in the office sorting supplies, I heard tapping from above through the vent. Not footsteps. Deliberate tapping. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. I turned off my light and froze. Then a voice came through the metal, female, hoarse, close enough to vibrate the grill. "Anybody in this building?" I did not answer. The tapping resumed. "I heard something earlier. If you're in there, I'm not looking for trouble." I stayed silent so long my jaw hurt. After a minute, she moved away. I heard her footsteps faintly in the hallway above, then a door somewhere, then nothing. I sat in the dark and hated myself. The next morning, I found evidence she had been near the basement entrance. The outer door chain I'd coiled neatly was disturbed. Not opened, just moved, as if someone had tested the weight and decided against it. There was also a plastic grocery bag on the top step. Inside was a half loaf of bread and a note torn from lined paper. "Need insulin for my dad. If someone is in there and has medical supplies, please leave note in bag." I still think about that note. I had no insulin. Even if I had, I could not have confirmed what kind, how much, how old it was, whether it had spoiled. I wrote "no insulin. Sorry" on the back of a county memo sheet and put it in the bag after dark. The bread I left untouched for 2 hours, then brought inside because letting food sit outside in a failing town was not kindness. It was waste. The next day, the bag was gone. By the end of the first week, I had a workable system. I lined the office vent grill with layers. First wire mesh to keep debris or probing fingers out if anyone ever found the duct roots, then folded blankets, then foam panels held in place with wire and tape, leaving a gap at the bottom for airflow. In the utility room, I wrapped sections of exposed duct in insulation where they crossed metal hangers. I cut strips from old cot canvas and used them as vibration dampers between loose panels and brackets. It was ugly and probably a fire code violation in 6 different ways, but it reduced the ringing whenever something bumped the ducts. I also stopped using the powered blower except for short air exchanges during noisy periods outside, when wind picked up or when distant vehicles masked the sound. Instead, I learned the dampers and created a low passive draw through 1 intake and 1 exhaust line. Air quality was not ideal, but with 1 person and no flames, it was manageable. The shelter smelled like dust, old paper, and me. I made rules for myself and wrote them on a clipboard I found in the office because rules on paper feel more real. No noise after dark unless life-threatening. No opening doors without listening first. No inviting anyone in without a plan. Waterlog every use. Always leave with a reason. Return before dark. The third rule became the hardest one. It was 11 days after I entered the shelter when the first person I let inside almost got us both killed. His name was Alan Rusk. He was 62, a retired HVAC technician who lived in a trailer park on the edge of town and looked like a man carved from old denim. long face, gray beard, raw hands, eyes that missed nothing. I knew him by sight because he'd fixed the rooftop unit at the elementary school one summer while I was teaching summer reading support. He probably knew me as that teacher lady with the tote bag. I found him sitting on the courthouse steps with a bandaged forearm and a 5-gallon bucket between his boots. I nearly walked past. I had gone out to check the municipal building across the square for bottled water and vending machine stock and some paperwork cabinets I thought might hold batteries or flashlights. I came around the corner and saw him immediately. He had a short-handled shovel laid across his lap like a tool, not a weapon. His left sleeve was dark with old blood, not fresh. He looked exhausted, in the bone-deep way of someone who has stopped pretending he is okay. He raised one hand slowly and said, "Denise Carver, right? Sub at Maple Ridge." Every bad decision starts with something familiar. I did not go closer. "How do you know my name?" "School unit, air handler in the gym. You brought me coffee one morning. Black, too much sugar." He glanced at my backpack. "You moving quiet. Means you got a place. I'm not asking where if you don't want to tell me." His voice was low, controlled, not pleading. That scared me more than begging would have. "What happened to your arm?" "Cut on sheet metal 3 days ago. I cleaned it." He lifted the bandage edge enough to show a stitched line. Clumsy but clean. No obvious swelling around it. "I can still work. I'm not here to be carried." "Why are you here?" He looked toward the empty street before answering. "Because this square is brick and stone. Line of sight is decent, and there's a basement sign on the annex wall. Figured I'd ask before I tried something stupid. I should have left. Instead, I asked, 'Who's with you?' No one now." That now sat between us. I made him wait while I circled once, checked the alleys, and listened. Then I told him to stand up slowly, leave the shovel, and walk ahead of me to the basement door with his hands visible. I kept the pry bar ready and hated how natural that felt after less than 2 weeks. At the top of the stairs, I stopped him. "If I let you in, you follow my rules. Any shouting, any grabbing, any surprises, you're out." He nodded once. "Fair." The moment the inner shelter door closed behind us, his face changed. Not fear exactly. Relief so sudden it looked like pain. He put one hand on the wall and just stood there, breathing stale bunker air like it was mountain wind. "Hell," he said softly, "you actually did it." What I'd actually done was create a fragile hideout for one person. Alan saw a machine he could help repair. Within an hour, he had identified 3 things I'd missed and 2 I had done wrong. First, the passive ventilation path I set up worked, but one damper seal was leaking around the frame, causing backflow when wind hit the building from the north. Second, the blower motor bearings could be lubricated enough for short runs if we scavenged proper oil, and the belt tension was too tight, which was making the squeal worse. Third, one of the water drum taps had galvanic corrosion at the threads and would fail if forced. He also told me my blanket-over-vent sound baffle in the office was restricting airflow too much and increasing condensation risk. He was right. By the end of that day, we had a better air cycle plan, a maintenance schedule written on the same clipboard as my rules, and a second cot set up in the records room, not my office, because I wasn't ready to share a sleeping wall. I did not fully trust Alan, but I trusted competence. In a failing world, that can look a lot like hope. He told me what had happened in fragments while we worked. He had started with his ex-wife's sister and her adult son at the trailer park. The son got sick first after helping a neighbor who got bit trying to break up a fight. Alan never used the word zombie, not once, even when describing exactly that. They barricaded in, ran out of water, then tried to relocate to a church where others were gathering. The group splintered on the road after a crash and a panic. He lost them in the confusion and never found them again. His forearm cut came from crawling under a bent warehouse door. He'd been sleeping in a machine shed for 2 nights before he saw me crossing the square earlier that week and realized someone was using the area intelligently. That last part unnerved me. I had thought I was invisible. I was only less obvious than most. Alan also brought something I badly needed. A cooler with insulin syringes and glucose test strips. "Empty now," he said when he saw me looking. "Belonged to Vera at Lot 12. She didn't make it." He put the cooler on the desk like an offering. But the cooler itself and ice packs, if you can keep them cold anyway, useful. And if that woman comes back asking about insulin, tell her this town clinic got hit first day. Pharmacy stock likely gone. I told him about the note signed L. He stared at the desk for a long moment and said, "There's going to be a lot of those." He was right about that too. For 6 days, the 2-person version of the shelter almost felt sustainable. We worked in shifts. One listened while the other slept. We scavenged on alternating days, never together unless the load demanded it. Alan improved the outer basement door by adding a silent latch and an interior brace system made from shelving angle iron and carriage bolts so we could secure it without relying on the broken hasp. I organized the storeroom into categories like a classroom closet: water treatment, tools, first aid, sanitation, food dry goods, food canned, lighting, cloth, hardware. We found a locked janitor cage in the courthouse basement and got bleach tablets, mops, contractor bags, nitrile gloves, and 2 bottles of hearing protection foam plugs that I laughed at until I realized how useful they were for sleeping through distant noise without losing all awareness. We also found a county emergency planning binder in a file cabinet upstairs. Most of it was outdated, but it contained building schematics including duct runs and utility shutoffs. That binder changed our security decisions. It confirmed 2 vertical vent shafts rose through the annex walls to rooftop hoods, and a third connected into an older crawl space beneath the courthouse side corridor. Sound could travel all 3 routes depending on damper position. It also meant there were multiple access points someone determined enough could probe from above. We started treating the ducts like doors. Then people found us. Not because we were careless with lights, not because Alan talked too loud. Because public buildings attract need, and need spreads information faster than any network. It began with a kid. He was maybe 14, skinny, wearing a Cardinals hoodie 2 sizes too big and carrying a bicycle wheel without a bike. He knocked on the outer basement door in the middle of the afternoon and called down, "Miss Carver? Alan says you got water." Alan went pale. I never said where. I hissed, "How does he know your name?" The kid answered from outside before Alan could. "He fixed our furnace 2 winters ago. I'm Nate. My mom's at the dental office and she says I should ask before we take anything." Everything in me tightened at the phrase "before we take anything." I cracked the outer door 3 inches with the brace still in place and saw him on the landing alone, eyes red from no sleep, hands trembling from adrenaline and probably hunger. The bicycle wheel was from a cart he'd rigged, he explained in a rush. He pointed toward the square where I could just make out movement in the doorway of the old dental office. "Mom says there's some old people and 1 baby," he said. "We got a little food, need water, and a place to fill containers. We won't tell." That last sentence told me he knew exactly how important the secret was, and exactly how fragile. I did not invite him in. I handed out 2-gallon jugs of treated water, a roll of gauze, and 4 cans of soup through the gap. And I told him, "You do not come back here after dark. You do not bring anyone to this door. If your mother wants to talk, she comes alone tomorrow at noon and stands on the courthouse steps where I can see her hands." He nodded so fast I thought his neck might snap. "Yes, ma'am." When he left, Alan said, "We just crossed a line." "I know. What's the plan now?" I looked at the manual on the desk, opened to the chapter on maintaining order, and said, "We stop pretending this is only a hideout. We make it a shelter or we lose it." At noon the next day, his mother came. Her name was Lori Mendez, 41, dental hygienist, practical voice, no wasted motions. She had her father with her, Ernesto, diabetic, 68, weak but alert, and a young woman named Kayla Winters carrying a 6-month-old girl named June. They had been holed up in the dental office because it had interior rooms, a backup generator for short periods, and bottled water from a cooler service. The generator fuel was almost gone. The baby formula would run out in days. They had heard the annex basement was occupied and initially planned to break in at night if necessary. Lori stopped them and sent Nate first because she recognized my name from school newsletters. I appreciated the honesty and did not trust them anymore for it. We held the conversation in the square at distance like a negotiation. I set conditions before I offered anything. No one comes to the basement entrance unannounced. No one follows me to or from scavenging runs. No shouting. No weapons in hand during meetings. All requests made in daylight at a set time. In return, I would trade water treatment support and limited food coordination for information and labor. Alan added that if they needed medical help beyond basic first aid, we probably could not provide it, and they needed to say so plainly instead of hoping. Lori listened, asked 2 smart questions about sanitation and ventilation, and then said, "You're talking like this is a school and we're students." I almost snapped back. Instead, I said, "I'm talking like people panic when rules are unclear." She looked at Alan. "And you agree with this?" "Completely," he said. That was the beginning of the Courthouse Square group, and it almost got us killed within 48 hours. The first real conflict wasn't over food, it was over admission. Word spread. It always does. By the 3rd day after Lori's visit, we had 7 regulars in the orbit of the square, and twice that many people passing through. Some stayed one night in nearby buildings and moved on. Some tried to trade, some watched too closely. The ones who mattered became a loose ring of survivors using the stone and brick structures around the square because they were defensible and centrally located. Besides me and Alan in the shelter, and Lori's group in the dental office, there was Devin Shaw, an auto parts store manager with a bad knee and a surprisingly disciplined approach to inventory. May Holloway, 73, retired librarian, living alone above the antique store with more canned peaches than anyone I've ever met. Curtis Bell, former volunteer firefighter, broad-shouldered and loud even when whispering, who moved between buildings carrying messages because he couldn't stand sitting still. And a married couple, Jen and Paul Ritter, who had been traveling through in an RV when roads closed and now treated every conversation like a negotiation over campground hookups. Then there were the drifters, the desperate, the watchers. The shelter itself became a symbol before most people ever saw inside it. A fallout shelter sounded secure. That word alone made people imagine protection, food, authority. We had none of those in the amounts they imagined, but expectation can be more dangerous than scarcity. It came to a head when a man named Blake Harmon showed up with 3 others at dusk carrying backpacks and a shotgun. I knew Blake by reputation only. Worked seasonal construction. Did side jobs, trouble when drinking, charm when he needed something. He was not drunk. He was focused, which was worse. He stood in the square and called out, "We know there's a county shelter here, public building, public shelter, open it." Curtis, who should have stayed hidden, answered from behind a truck, "It's not a hotel, move along." Blake laughed once and fired the shotgun into the air. The sound hit the buildings and came back 3 times. I felt it in the shelter through the ducts like someone had slammed a steel drum with a hammer. June started crying in the dental office. Someone upstairs in the annex dropped something metal. Alan grabbed my shoulder and mouthed, "No lights." Blake shouted again, "Open it now or we start checking basements one by one." What followed was not a gunfight. It was worse. A standoff built on fear, noise, and bad information. Lori had a pistol she barely knew how to use. Curtis had an axe and too much confidence. Devin had a hunting rifle and the sense to stay out of sight. I had a pry bar and the shelter door. Alan had a wrench and a plan. He whispered, "We use the building, not force." He sent me to the utility room and pointed at the blower controls. "When I signal, run it full and cut in 10 seconds. Then again from the other damper setup." I understood halfway through and hated how clever it was. Using the schematics and damper positions, we could route the blower noise and airflow pulses through different duct branches, making it sound like movement and machinery in multiple sections of the annex and possibly the courthouse corridor. In a tense situation with echoes and no line of sight, it could suggest more people than we had, organized people with power. Alan slipped to the stairwell and, without opening the outer door, used a length of pipe to bang twice on the inner steel frame. Through the vent system his voice carried, deep and amplified by concrete. "County emergency shelter is occupied. Back away from the entrance. You are being observed." It was a pure bluff, and it sounded official enough to pause them. Blake shouted, "Observed by who?" Alan looked at me and chopped his hand. I threw the blower switch. The motor screamed alive. Old bearings, belt slap, fan surge, air hammer through metal ducts. I counted to 8 and shut it off. The noise tore through the annex like an industrial system powering up after a blackout. From outside, with no map of the ductwork, it must have sounded like multiple units in movement. We heard cursing in the square. Someone yelled, "They got generators." Another voice, not Blake's, said, "Forget this." Alan signaled again, changed one damper, and I ran the blower a second burst. This time, the vibration came through a different branch and rattled a vent in the courthouse side wall. To anyone outside, it would sound like occupants in more than one structure. Devin took the cue and shouted from somewhere high, "Back off the square!" A single rifle round cracked into brick near Blake's feet. Warning shot. Risky, but effective. The men retreated fast after that, not because they were beaten, but because uncertainty replaced opportunity. When it was quiet again, my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't turn the blower switch fully off on the first try. Curtis came to the basement door later and whispered down, "That was mean. I liked it." I did not. We had just advertised that the shelter was defended and worth challenging. That night, I opened the Civil Defense Manual again and found the section on conflict. The language was dated, paternal, full of references to shelter discipline and firm leadership. But one line hit me harder than anything else in the book. Unclear authority invites contests. That was exactly what was happening in the square. We were a cluster of scared adults with supplies spread across buildings, no chain of command, no communication system, and a public shelter everyone wanted to define differently. The next morning, I did something I never expected to do in my life. I held a meeting in the old county tax room and assigned jobs. Not because I wanted power, because the alternative was chaos. We kept it small. Me, Alan, Lori, Devin, May, and Curtis. The Ritters were invited, but sent Paul, who spent the first 10 minutes arguing about whether all contributions would be properly credited, and then quieted down when May told him she had cataloged books longer than he had been alive and could count canned beans without his help. I laid out the facts. The shelter below could not support everyone sleeping inside. Airflow, sanitation, and water alone made that impossible long-term. Without major work, we could not do safely. It could serve as secure storage, triage, brief refuge during attacks, and housing for those best suited to maintain systems. That was me and Alan by function, not status. The square group needed distributed sheltering by building, shared watches, shared information and ration coordination, or else we would repeat every failure the manual warned about. Then I said the part that made Curtis stare at me like I had grown a second head. We need rules everyone hates equally. Alan almost smiled. By the end of that meeting, we had the closest thing to a system our little patch of town ever got. Lori ran medical and hygiene coordination, which mostly meant wound checks, isolation decisions, and teaching people to stop wasting bleach. Devin managed inventory logs because he was good at numbers and suspicious by nature. May handled records, names, and messages, who was where, what they needed, what they promised, what they actually delivered. Curtis led exterior watch and fire suppression because he understood building risk and could move. I coordinated shelter operations, water treatment, and admissions to the basement. Alan maintained ventilation, structural fixes, and improvised repairs. We established quiet hours after dark. We marked clean and dirty zones in each occupied building. We banned open fires indoors except in designated areas with ventilation and watch. We set a noon exchange window in the square. We made a rule that no one approached the basement entrance except me, Alan, Lori, or one designated runner. We also made the hardest rule of all: no automatic admission for newcomers. That one nearly broke us more than once. The town around us kept changing. By the third week, the loud, frantic phase had passed. Fewer engines, more smoke columns in the distance, occasional gunshots, usually far off. At night, we heard wandering impact sounds. Things knocked over, windows failing, doors banging in wind, sometimes human voices, sometimes the unsteady moaning sounds that by then we all recognized and stopped naming. The infected, if that's what we are calling them, were not a coordinated horde in our area. They were scattered, drawn by noise and movement, dangerous in close quarters and terrifying because they used familiar human shapes and never seemed to tire in the same way healthy people did. The real threat most days was still other survivors. Infections and violence blurred together in memory, but I can separate the day the shelter truly became my last stand because it involved both. It started with Nate. He came to the square at 10:20 a.m., early for exchange, white-faced and breathing hard. "Mom says, 'Come now,'" he blurted. "Grandpa won't wake up right." I ran with Lori to the dental office and knew before we reached Ernesto's room that something was wrong beyond low blood sugar. He was awake, technically, eyes open and moving, but confused, sweating cold, and unable to answer simple questions. Lori checked him with the glucose meter from Alan's salvaged kit. Too low to register. They had stretched insulin badly, then overcorrected, then run out of food overnight when a storage shelf collapsed and spoiled what little they had. Lori was shaking as she tried to explain. Not panic shaking, guilt shaking. We got sugar into him slowly and brought him around enough to swallow and track our voices. It should have been a relief. It was, for about 15 minutes. Then Curtis came in from the square, whisper shouting, "They're back, Blake and more." From the dental office front window I counted at least 8 people moving between cars and storefronts, armed with a mix of crowbars, one shotgun, and what looked like a pistol. Blake was in front. They were not raiding at random this time. They had watched us long enough to know which buildings mattered. The square group split on instinct. Devin and Paul wanted to fall back immediately and hide. Curtis wanted to confront. Lori refused to move Ernesto until he was stable. May, who had come down the alley carrying a ledger of all things, said, "If they take one building, they take the square by evening." She was right. I made a decision I had been trying not to make since the first day I found the shelter. "Bring Ernesto and the baby to the basement," I said. "Temporary. Only them and one caregiver each." Lori stared at me. "You said—" "I know what I said. Move now." Alan met us at the basement door, took one look at Ernesto and just nodded. Office and records room. Keep airpath clear. The transfer took less than 4 minutes and made more noise than I liked. June cried halfway down the stairs. I thought that sound would end us. Maybe it almost did. Outside, Blake's group started calling out demands. Food, water, access to county resources. One of them shouted that they had people with injuries. Another shouted that we were hoarding in a public emergency building. That part was true, in the strictest sense. Truth can be used like a pry bar. I wanted to negotiate. Alan did not. Not with him, he said. He's testing response time. He was right again. The first strike came at the dental office, not the annex. A side window shattered, then another. Curtis and Devin drove them back with noise, and one aimed shot into pavement. But the point wasn't entry. The point was pressure. While we reacted there, 2 men slipped down the annex alley toward the basement door. I heard the outer steps before I saw them. Metal scrape, whispered curse, wait on the landing. Alan was already at the inner door with the wrench and the pry bar. He spoke without turning. Denise, lights out. Everyone quiet. Lori, baby close. Ernesto needs to breathe slow if he can. As then the outer latch rattled. The new brace held the first shove. The second hit harder. Someone outside grunted, "It's barred." A voice I didn't know said, "Get the hinge pins." Alan mouthed one word to me. Boiler. There was no boiler, not a working one. What he meant was the old utility room steam line and the maintenance trick we had set up 2 days earlier. A pressurized cleaning canister system using a metal garden sprayer, bleach solution, and a length of hose routed near the stairwell through an old wall sleeve. We had built it to disinfect the landing if contamination got in. It could also be used as a surprise. I moved to the utility room in the dark by touch, found the sprayer, cracked the valve, and waited for Alan's signal. At the door, someone outside started hammering metal on metal. Hinge pins, smart enough to go around the brace. Alan called through the inner door in his deepest official voice. Step away from the basement entrance. Chemical decontamination is in progress. The men outside laughed. Alan chopped his hand. I opened the valve fully. A harsh spray burst into the stairwell through the hidden hose outlet, atomizing bleach solution into the enclosed landing. Men outside shouted and coughed instantly. One slipped on the wet step and crashed into the outer door. The hammer dropped and clanged. It was not poison. It was diluted bleach and shock and zero visibility in a cramped space, but in panic it felt like a trap. While they were reeling, Curtis, bless his terrible timing and bravery, charged the alley entrance above and yelled like half the National Guard was behind him. Devin fired one round into the dumpster lid for noise. The echo was brutal. The attackers scattered from the stairwell, cursing and half-blind. For maybe 60 seconds we held. Then the infected came. Noise had been building all morning. Gunshots, breaking glass, shouting. The shotgun blast Blake fired when he fell back towards the square. We heard the first impacts against the courthouse side doors like heavy fists. Then more from Main Street. The sounds multiplied, messy and converging. And even underground I could tell the pattern had changed from human movement to something less organized and more relentless. Blake's people tried to retreat through the square at the same time the infected entered it from 2 directions. You learn fast in those moments what part of your fear is theory and what part is practical. I was afraid of attack. I was more afraid of the basement door failing with a baby and a diabetic man inside. We shut everything down and held. The noises above turned into a layered nightmare of impacts, running feet, glass, yelling, then abrupt cutoffs. Through the ducts we heard fragments from different rooms and roof vents. Someone screaming for Darren, a shotgun blast indoors, furniture dragging, moaning close enough to vibrate the vent mesh. June began to cry again, and Lori pressed her against her chest, rocking silently, tears running down her face but no sound from her mouth. Ernesto, pale and weak on the cot, gripped the side rail and whispered prayers in Spanish. Alan and I sat by the inner door with tools in our hands and listened to the building decide whether it would hold. This is the part people always want turned into action when they hear stories later. They expect a breakout, a heroic counterattack, some clean moment where the right choice is obvious. There wasn't one. There were 6 hours underground while a public square failed above us. We rotated short ventilation runs when outside noise was highest to mask the blower. We rationed water by mouthfuls because stress makes everyone thirsty. We put foam plugs in June's ears when the noise got too sharp and she started startling awake. We did not open the door to check. Twice, someone pounded on the outer door and shouted to be let in. Once, it sounded like Curtis. Once, it sounded like a stranger. We did not open. I still don't know if Curtis ever made it to those steps. By late evening, the sound thinned. Not quiet, just less. The kind of silence after damage when you know the world is changed but haven't seen how. We waited until full dark plus another hour before Alan cracked the outer door from behind the brace. The alley was empty except for a dropped hammer, a bent pry bar, and bleach-streaked footprints. The square looked like a place after a storm made of people. I won't describe it in the ways that get repeated online because the important part was not the worst visual details. The important part was structure and consequence. Windows were gone. 2 storefront doors hung open. A pickup had rolled slowly into a fountain curb and died there. Supplies were scattered everywhere because panic and conflict had broken containers open before anyone could secure them. The shotgun was on the pavement near the courthouse steps, empty. Blake was nowhere I could see. May's antique store lower door was splintered. The dental office front was wrecked. Curtis was not in the square. Neither were the Ritters. Devon was alive, hoarse, and hiding in the auto parts back room with a scalp cut and one hand swollen. He told us in pieces what had happened after the alley push failed. Blake's group fell back firing and shouting. The noise drew infected from side streets and from a bus stop shelter where several had been trapped or wandering. The square turned into a funnel. Some people ran for buildings and made it, some didn't. Curtis tried to pull Nate clear when Nate froze at the dental office corner. Lori had dragged Nate inside before I got Ernesto and June down. But during the second wave, Curtis went back out again to cover Devon and lost sight of everyone in the chaos. May was alive upstairs, barricaded, furious, and bleeding from a cut on her forearm caused by broken glass, not a bite. The Ritter's RV was gone from where they had hidden it behind the feed store annex lot. Whether they escaped or ran, nobody knew. That night, with the square unsafe and half our group missing, I made the shelter what I had resisted making it. I opened the basement to the survivors we could verify and control. Not everyone, not public, not a crowd. A screened group with roles, limits, and rules I enforced like my life depended on it because it did. May came first after Lori checked her wound. Devon came next, limping. Nate came down carrying a milk crate of dental office supplies because his hands needed a task. Lori moved between Ernesto and June in the stairwell like she was trying to be in 3 places at once. Alan reorganized sleeping areas and air schedules on the fly. I stood at the door with a clipboard and a flashlight and hated the person I had to be. No weapons in sleeping area. No raised voices. Bucket latrine backup if plumbing fails. Report every wound. No one touches food stores without log entry. Night watch in pairs. If the door is pounded after lights out, only I or Alan respond. If anyone tries to force entry from inside or outside without group decision, they are restrained. May looked at my list and said, "You've become principal." I said, "No. Hall monitor with ventilation concerns." She laughed once, then started crying so quietly I almost missed it. The days after the square collapse blurred into work. The shelter, built for 120 in short-term crisis, was now supporting 8 people in long-term survival mode. That was exactly the mismatch I had feared from day one. We were not dying from a lack of bunk space. We were grinding ourselves down on sanitation, air, noise, and trust. Air first. 8 bodies meant humidity, and carbon dioxide rose fast in closed rooms. Alan and I set strict ventilation windows and maintenance checks. We scavenged proper machine oil from a garage and got the blower tolerable for timed runs. We built better intake baffles using furnace filters, layered cloth, and wire frames to reduce dust and muffle sound. We monitored condensation on pipes and walls as a crude proxy for airflow issues. It was not scientific enough for a lab, but it was better than guessing. Water next. The old drums were finite and questionable. We established a collection route to gather water heaters, toilet tanks from uncontaminated buildings, and rain runoff from one annex downspout routed into clean trash cans through improvised cloth and screen filters. Then we treated everything. Filter, bleach, contact time, labels. Lori enforced hand washing like a prison warden, and I loved her for it. Sanitation was harder than food sabas. With unreliable plumbing, we set up lined bucket toilets in the latrine room as backup and used bleach solution and strict disposal routines. The Civil Defense Manual had entire pages on waste discipline. I used them. It was not glamorous. It kept us from getting sick. Then came governance, a word I hate because it sounds too formal for what we were. A group of frightened people in a basement deciding how not to ruin each other. The first serious internal conflict was over Nate. He was useful, quick, and brave in the reckless way teenagers can be when fear and purpose mix. He wanted to go topside constantly. Devin wanted him on runs because he moved fast and fit through broken openings. Lori wanted him near the dental office because it still held supplies. May wanted him nowhere near danger because she had decided, without saying it directly, that he was now everyone's child to protect. Nate wanted to be treated like an adult, and not one of us agreed what that meant. When he disobeyed a direct order and followed Devin on a dawn scavenging trip, they came back with batteries, canned vegetables, and a fresh scrape on Nate's shoulder from climbing through broken glass. No bite, no infection signs. Still, I lost my temper. I yelled. Not loud by normal standards, but loud enough to ring the ductwork. The whole shelter went still. Nate shouted back that he was not a little kid, and that if he hadn't gone, Devin wouldn't have gotten the batteries because the back window was too narrow. Devin admitted that was true, then added, "We need what he can do." Lori stepped between us like she expected me to swing at someone, which shocked me into silence. That night, I read the manual again, this time the section on assigning meaningful work to reduce conflict. It sounded patronizing on the page. In practice, it was dead right. The next morning, I apologized to Nate in front of everyone and gave him a job with authority: runner, coordinator, and entry scribe. He tracked who went out, where, with what, and when they returned. He logged supplies. He learned to ask questions like a teacher taking attendance and like a quartermaster checking lies. The responsibility changed him in a week. It also made him a target if anyone wanted access to stores, which is how I learned that leadership in a shelter does not reduce danger. It redistributes it. Weeks passed. I lost track, then rebuilt the count from May's notes. 29 days from my first entry into the shelter. 15 since the square collapse. 9 since we last saw Blake's group. 3 since Curtis returned. He came in at sunrise, thin, limping, and quiet for the first time in his life. Alan almost didn't let him through because Curtis failed the wound check, Too many bruises, dehydration, and a nasty tear on his calf hidden under duct tape and a shop towel. Lori looked at it Curtis, and said, "That's from rebar, not teeth, but it's infected." Curtis nodded and sat down on the top step like his strings had been cut. He had survived in the crawlspace above the feed store freezer room after getting separated in the square. Spent 2 days too scared to move, then 3 moving between rooftops and attics because the streets were bad. He'd seen the Ritters heading west in the RV with 1 extra passenger he couldn't identify. He'd seen Blake alive 2 days after the attack with only 1 companion, both armed, heading toward the industrial park. He came back because, in his words, "I got tired of surviving stupid." Curtis's return changed morale more than any supply run. It also brought intelligence we needed. Our town wasn't emptying. It was fragmenting into pockets. Small groups in churches, machine sheds, a motel on the highway, maybe a larger armed cluster near the industrial park using forklifts and fenced lots to hold space. That information forced the question we had all been avoiding. Were we staying in the courthouse annex shelter indefinitely, or was this a bridge to somewhere else? I called a meeting and expected an argument. I got silence. Then May said, "This place is defensible because people think it already failed." It was the smartest summary of our position I'd heard. She was right. The square attack and collapse had made the area look dangerous and partly picked over. The broken windows and scattered remains of that day discouraged casual scavengers. Our basement entrance was hidden enough if approached correctly. We had systems now. Imperfect, but real. Moving a mixed group, including Ernesto and June, without a known, safer destination would be gambling what little stability we had. So we stayed. Staying did not mean waiting. Over the next month, we turned survival into maintenance, and maintenance into a kind of life. Alan and I built a secondary quiet room in the old record storage using foam panels, cot canvas, and salvaged office partitions so June could sleep farther from the ducts. Lori created a medical corner with labeled bins and a quarantine protocol for anyone returning with respiratory symptoms or suspicious wounds. Devin taught Nate inventory forecasting using a legal pad and pencil marks because batteries were too precious for constant flashlight use. May started evening readings, not novels, not sentimental things, but practical pages from old almanacs, local history pamphlets, and once, to everyone's surprise, the Civil Defense Manual itself. She read the chapter on rumor control in a dry librarian voice and had us all laughing by the end. Curtis, once his leg improved, reinforced the alley approach with passive obstacles that looked like junk but slow to rush. Loose rebar bundles, rolling bins without wheels, a chain loop at shin height visible only if you knew where to look. Not traps meant to injure. Delays meant to buy seconds and noise. We also made the most important long-term decision of my life. We stopped treating the shelter as mine. I know the title of this story, and I know why people like it. My last stand sounds decisive. It sounds like one woman against the end of the world. But the truth is uglier and better. I found the shelter. I broke in, I made the first rules. Then the place nearly got us all killed because I tried to hold it like private safety in a public collapse. It only became survivable when it stopped being mine and became ours, with limits. Not open to all, not cruel, not naive, just honest about capacity. That honesty got tested one final time in a way I still replay. It was early winter by then. We tracked seasons more by cold seeping into concrete than by calendars. Our group was down to 7 in the shelter full-time because Devin had moved to a nearby machine shop with 2 others to expand our scavenging radius while keeping the annex as anchor. Ernesto died in his sleep one night, peaceful and warm, after a week where he'd been strong enough to tell stories about learning to drive in Texas. We buried him in the courthouse lawn at dawn under a maple tree with no speeches because sound carried. Lori cried into her scarf. Nate held June while she slept through it. 2 weeks after that, there was a knock at noon. Not pounding. 3 measured knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. The same pattern I had heard in the ducks on my first week. I went to the stairwell and asked through the door, "Who is it?" A woman answered, older now in the voice somehow, worn thin but steady. "Lena, I left a note for insulin a long time ago." I opened the outer door gap and recognized her face only after a second. The woman from the vent voice. She looked 20 years older than she should have. Beside her stood a teenage girl and a man with a cane made from a shovel handle. No visible weapons in hand. 2 backpacks. 1 plastic grocery bag tied shut. "I figured you'd be gone," she said. "So did I answered. She lifted the grocery bag. "Bread this time is worse." I almost laughed. Alan came up behind me but stayed out of sight. The group had rules for this. Screening questions, wound checks, isolation space, capacity review, labor roles. We had room for maybe 1, possibly 2 if we tightened water and expanded rotation to the machine shop. 3 would strain air and food unless they brought skills and supplies worth the risk. Lena, whose full name was Lena Pritchard, had a diabetic husband who had died in August and a daughter, Tessa, who knew basic veterinary assisting from working at an animal clinic. The man with the cane was her brother, Roy, a retired postal carrier with a healing ankle fracture and an almost obsessive knowledge of every street and service lane within 10 miles. Their current hideout had failed after roof damage and repeated break-ins. They had watched the annex for days before approaching. I looked at the 3 of them and thought of every rule I had written. I thought of June sleeping in the quiet room, of our air schedules, of our finite stores, of the square collapse, of people pounding on the door while we hid in the dark and chose not to open. I thought of the civil defense line about unclear authority inviting contests. I thought of another line May had read out loud and mocked gently. The shelter manager must avoid both harshness and sentimentality. Impossible when I first... That line had sounded impossible when I first read it. Standing there with the cold coming down the stairwell, I finally understood it. I did not say yes right away. I said, "Set the bag down. Step back. We do this in order." Lena nodded like she expected nothing less. That is how the forgotten civil defense shelter became my last stand and then something larger than a last stand. Not a fortress, not a miracle. A managed compromise in a public building built for a different fear. I was a substitute teacher who found an old sign and followed it underground because I had nowhere else to go. I became the person at the door because someone had to be. I learned that concrete walls do not make safety by themselves. Systems do. Quiet does. Water logs and sanitation and maintenance and watch rotations do. So do rules people resent until the day those rules save them. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.